Hi, I'm Izzy, and this is Dizzy Quilts and Sews. In today's video, we have block number 3 of our Quilt As You Go sampler quilt along. All right, so block 3, this is what we are aiming for. This is called the maple leaf block. And to make this block, we are going to need 2 fabrics. So our colored fabric for the leaf and our background fabric. So only 2 this time around. Now what we're going to do is piece half square triangles for these blocks over here. We're going to have some plain blocks, and I'm going to show you how to insert a strip of fabric between 2 triangles here for the stem of our leaf. For my block, I'm going to use my gray Kona, is this silver? No, Dove, so Kona Dove. And for my leaf, I'm going to use this blue fabric here, which I think is going to go very nicely with my first 2 blocks. So I'm going to go press my fabric, get everything cut, and then I'll come back and show you the pieces you need to get ready for this. All right, so I've got all of my pieces. So for my maple leaf, I've got 2 5-inch squares. I've got 3 4.5 squares, and I've got 1 1.5 by 7-inch strip. From my background, I've got 3 5-inch squares, and I've got 1 4.5-inch square. And again, all of these measurements are going to be down in the description box below. If you need a quick refresher on how to prep and cut your fabric, I'm going to link to a video I put out on the channel a few weeks ago, and you can refer to that before you go ahead and cut all your pieces. Now, in addition to your fabrics for the block, you're going to need our 14-inch square piece of batting, as well as a backing fabric. So I've got all of my fabrics at the ready. Next, we're going to start piecing our block. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is piece our half square triangles. And these are it over here. So we're going to need 2 5-inch squares of our fabric, of our colored fabric, and we're going to need 2 5-inch background squares. And like we've done for our other quilt blocks, we're going to pair 1 background and 1 colored fabric right sides together, like this. Try to align them as best you can. We're going to trim those down anyway, so I wouldn't worry about messing things up here. And then we're going to mark a line from corner to corner on our background fabric. This is on the back of your fabric, so you can use any marking tool that you like. You shouldn't have to worry about it peeking through. So I've got my lines marked down the middle of my block, and now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch a line on a quarter inch away from the marked line on both sides. If you have a 1/4 inch foot, now's the time to get it out. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, I would strongly suggest you mark 2 more lines, one on either side of this line here, and stitch on those 2 lines. So what we want is stitching on either side of this line that we just marked, 1/4 inch away from it. And we're going to do this for both of these pieces. All right, so I have my 2 lines of stitching, so 1 on either side of my marked line. And now I'm going to take my rotary cutter and a ruler and cut on the marked line. So right down the middle. And I'm going to do that for both pieces. And now I'm going to go to the pressing station and press these open this way, so sending my seam allowance towards my darker fabric. So on the back side, the seam allowance is going to go towards my blue fabric. And open up all 4 of these, and then we're going to trim them. All right, so now I have my 4 flat half square triangles. What we now need to do is trim those to 4.5 inch square. So like we've done in the past, you can take, if you have a small ruler like this, very, very helpful. So what we want is, on my ruler, I have a 45-degree mark over here. And my 4.5 is right in here. So I'm going to center the 4.5 inch area on my little block, making sure that my 45-degree line here is right on top of my seam. All right, so I'm positive that the 4.5 inch area on my ruler is within the block and the 45-degree line is on the seam. And I'm just going to trim away the tiny little bits of fabric. There we go. Then flip it around. Now I'm going to line up my 4.5 inch measurement here on my ruler right at the edge that we just cut. And I'm going to trim the remaining 2 sides. Now I have a nice even 4.5 inch half square triangle with perfect corners here. See, if you don't line up your 45-degree line on the seam, the corners here won't have exactly like half and half of both fabrics. Your corners are going to be a little bit wonky. Like, is it absolutely catastrophic? No, but just, yeah, do your best. But, you know, there's nothing perfect in life. So again, I'm lining up my 45-degree line, making sure the 4.5 inch area on my ruler is within my little block, and trimming whatever is peeking out outside the ruler. There we go, number 2. And I have to say, although the little shreds of fabric is very satisfying, this is probably not my favorite activity in quilting, trimming blocks, but well worth it, because in the end you get much nicer finished blocks when you take a little bit extra time to be accurate here and have some nice clean edges. I've made a quilt once. It was a fairly large quilt. It was about 72 inches square, entirely made up of 4.5 inch half square triangles. So you can imagine I had hundreds of those that I had to trim before I put them in my quilt. Now that was tedious. All right, so now we've got our 4 beautiful half square triangles, and we're gonna set these aside for now and move on to our leaf stem. And for that, you're gonna take your 5 inch background square, so your remaining 5 inch square. You're gonna take a ruler and you are going to slice the square in half on the diagonal. So right down the middle. And you're not marking this, you're just cutting it in half like this. Then you're gonna take your 7-inch strip of your colored fabric and you're gonna put it right sides together on one of the halves, and you want the raw edge of your strip to be lined up against the diagonal cut you just made. All right, so I've got my strip lined up to basically the bias cut triangle here. Now I'm going to go to my sewing machine and try to center it as best you can. It should measure exactly the same as your cut edge. So try to line them up as best you can. And now you're going to stitch these together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so I'm going to go do that and come back in a second. All right, so I've sewn my strip and I've pressed it so that the seam allowance is going towards the blue fabric. Next, I'm going to take my other triangle and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to align the bias edge of my triangle with the other side of the strip, like this. And again, I'm going to sew this at a 1/4 inch and press, again, the seam allowance towards the blue fabric. All right, and this is what your little block should look like. So you've got a strip of colored fabric going exactly down the middle of your, well, what used to be a 5-inch background square. Now we need to trim this down to 4.5 inches so that it's the exact same size as all of our other little blocks. So I'm going to go back to my ruler. Now what I'm going to do, and again, I'm eyeballing this, I'm going to try and line up my 45-degree angle in the middle of this blue stripe. And I'm trying to center my 4.5 inch area in the middle of this pieced block. Again, I'm just eyeballing it. If I do this right, the corner here will have a nice point that's all blue. All right, it's looking not bad. Turn it around, do the same thing. So 4.5. And there we go. I have the stem of my maple leaf. And now we can put our block together. So at the bottom we have our stem, then we have a colored block, we have a half square triangle like this, then we've got another colored block, and then our third one like this, a half square triangle like this one. Then over here is a background square, and then finally our last two half square triangles like this. So once you put your puzzle pieces in here, it should look like a nice maple leaf. And just like we've done for all of our blocks so far, we're going to sew these in rows and then sew the rows together. So I'm going to start with the bottom row. I just like to do that. So I'm going to take the first square, put it on top of the second and on top of the third, and take my little pile to the sewing machine and sew each one at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, trying to be, again, as precise as you can, because if you're not, here's the thing, if your 1/4 inch seam allowance is not as accurate as possible, your block may not finish at 12.5 inches, which in and of itself is not the end of the world. We are going to trim each one of these blocks before we put them together in our quilt. So what we're going to do is look at basically at the sizes of all 9 of our blocks find the smallest one and then trim all of them to that smallest size. So if you're not super accurate, your quilt might be a little bit smaller than mine will, or it just might be a little bit bigger than mine will. But try to aim for a 1/4 inch seam allowance as consistently as possible. All right, so I'm gonna piece my maple leaf together, repeating this process 3 times, so making my 3 little piles, sewing my rows. Press your seam allowances open if you can. Everything's gonna lie a lot flatter that way. And then you're gonna sew each row together. And then once you've sewn all of that, we will come back and I'll show you how we're gonna quilt our little block. All right, so we're at the sewing machine. I've got my little quilt sandwich right here. So my beautiful, beautiful maple leaf. Now we are using the walking foot for this block, just like we did for the other 2 blocks. We're gonna do something a little bit different. So we are going to quilt some straight lines, but I encourage you to eyeball them. So don't measure anything. Don't take out your ruler and your marking pens. Just eyeball everything. So what we're going to do is we are going to quilt vertical lines. So going from the top of your leaf down to the bottom. We're going to stitch in the ditch first. So in these 2 seam lines over here. And then for each third, we're going to quilt 1 straight down the middle, and then on either side of that stitch line. So basically we're going to be dividing our columns into 4 mini sections. So straight down the seam lines first, and then down the middle of each block, like this one and this one, and then in between or right down the middle of each section. So you're going to basically end up with 9 lines of stitching across your block. And then with the walking foot again, we're going to have a little bit of fun and stitch some zigzag across each of our columns. It's going to give our block a really cool look. This is a method actually I learned from the book Walk by Jackie Gehring. She is my quilting idol. I'm going to link to her website below. She's pretty amazing. So, all right. You remember how to do this from the 2 previous blocks. So we are going to stitch in the ditch. Try to stay in the ditch. Starting with some short stitches to anchor and lock everything down. And then go up to a 3. And gently pulling your fabric flat so there are no puckers, because remember, we didn't baste anything. These are just being held together by your hands, basically. So go slow and try to stay in the ditch. And by the ditch, I mean right in the center of your seam line. If we do this right, we can barely tell there's some stitching in there. All right, go back down to a short stitch. And there's our first line. All right, so you can see my stitches a little bit. Can you see that? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and do the second line of stitching right in the other ditch. And then we're just gonna eyeball things and try to stay as straight as possible and basically split our columns up. right, and here we go. Now I'm going to go right down the center, small stitches, go up to a 3, and the trick to this is to not look at the needle. Don't look at the needle. Look in front of your foot. Look at where you want to go. All right, and there we go. There's my, hopefully you can see this in this busy print. So I'm going to do the same thing in the other 2 columns, going right down the middle. And when I'm done that, I'm going to flip my block and then stitch the remaining lines in the other direction to prevent any pulling or any drag lines. All right, I'm going to get that done and see you back here when I'm done the straight lines. All right, so there you go. All of my lines are nice and stitched and somewhat even. Again, you're eyeballing here. Now what we're going to do is stitch some zigzags inside each of our 3 columns. So we're only going to do 3 of them. So what you're going to do is you're going to start in one corner of the middle column and stitch to the other side completely, and then back again, and then again, and again, and again. I, again, want you to eyeball this. We're not going for precise, and we're not going for consistent distances. All we're going for is straight-ish lines as you're going from side to side. So I'm going to start with my short stitches. I'm going to go back up to my 3, and I'm aiming for somewhere here at the end of my middle column.
Here's what I found.
All right, I'm going to slow down as I get close to the seam, needle down. I'm going to raise my foot, swing the block around, and then start stitching in the other direction. I'm not measuring anything. All I'm going for here is straight lines from one seam to the other. There we go. And you can go slow here. Go. There you go. And here's what you're aiming for. Hopefully you can see the stitching lines. So going from here to here to here and so on. And now I'm going to repeat the same thing in the other 2 columns. And in this column, I'm probably going to start from this corner just because I started from here for the middle column and just going zigzag. You'll notice that the distance between each zig and zag is very, very different. So improvise, have fun, don't measure anything. Just try to keep your lines as you're stitching from side to side straight. All right, so get your other 2 columns done, and then I'll be back when I'm all finished. All right, there we go. Whoops, upside down. Our beautiful, beautiful maple leaf block, all quilted. And you could have so much fun with this quilting motif with the walking foot. You can choose different thread colors for your zigzags. You could go all kinds of crazy and have very, very narrow zigzags across just two of the lines. Or yes, I love this design. You can have a lot of fun with it. Like we did for all of our other blocks, you can now stay stitch all around at 1/8 inch just to keep everything secure, because we're not going to touch these for a little while, but no need to trim them. You can basically just leave them alone until we are ready to stitch them together into a quilt. Hopefully you enjoyed that and you like your little block. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them down in the comments below. Or, as always, you can send me an email. My email address is always in the description box. If you make the block, or when you make the block, please post it to Instagram and tag me at Dizzy Quilts blog. I would love to see your blocks. Thank you so much for playing along during this quilt along. I'm having so much fun. Please give the video a like on your way out if you liked it, and consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss another video during this quilt along. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.